Hi there, welcome back to the Non-Serviam podcast. I'm your host, Lucy Steigerwald, and today's internet guest is Vicky Osterweil. And welcome to Vicky. Hello. Thank you for your infinite patience throughout technical and bodily health problems.
It's my pleasure to be, we're all out here doing our best, and sometimes our bodies are not as excited as we are to do things. So
will be my memoir title, perhaps. Let me read your bio for the good people who are listening. Okay. Vicky is a Philadelphia-based writer, agitator, and worker whose first book, In Defense of Looting, described historical struggles for liberation in the U.S. She is a member of the Anarchist journal Caw and has written about the intersection of film, politics, and culture for publications such as the Paris Review, very fancy, Art in America, Jazeera America, the Baffler, I always like them, Dissent, Lux Magazine, and the New Inquiry, where she was also a culture editor for many years. And her newest book, which we're definitely going to talk about a good amount, is called The Extended Universe, How Disney Killed the Movies and Took Over the World. All right, if I may, I would like to start with the old, how would you describe your politics, if I demanded you describe them?
I circle my A's, I'm an anarchist. I would describe my politics as anti-authoritarian, anti-fascist, anti-racist abolitionist, I guess. If I want to add all the little things, revolutionary, not reformist, I guess. Yeah, those are some things I would say, having to do that.
Did you have any kind of journey to get here? Did you start anywhere that wasn't all that good stuff?
Yeah, I've been doing it for a while. As my first book sort of maybe indicates, I'm very interested in and an eager participant in street and social movement. I tend to think that a lot of our politics are shaped through struggle and through the experience of the world. Not necessarily like direct street conflict struggle, but like through building the world around us. I'm from the 1900s. I'm a millennial.
Me too.
Yeah, I grew up basically like being, whatever you call like a liberal, I think there's two different kinds of liberals, like one of which is like a class position that's like really committed, devoted. They might call themselves a centrist now. And there's the other sort of like reflexive, I think, of a small L liberal, which is like someone who believes in justice but hasn't really interacted with like movement or with politics in a real way, that I think most of us are.
That's fair.
And start as. So, started that way. And yeah, it was really, to the extent that I was sort of, I was radicalized through punk, like through sort of punk music and punk scenes and encountering anarchism that way. And then also, again, through the process of Occupy Wall Street in 2011. I was in New York and I was a participant in that. So those things, and I also happened to be, during that summer before, I happened to be in Barcelona when the Acampada movement was going on, which is largely forgotten here in the US, but which was also a movement of the squares, just like Occupy. So all of those things contributed, but every wave of movement has changed the way I think and the way I move. And the politics are an ongoing and constant transformative thing. I don't really vibe with, I think there is a tendency towards a kind of Christian conversion narrative. This was the moment I radicalized.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are things that have been consistent throughout my life about caring about the well-being of other people, being empathetic, wanting the world to be better, caring about the environment. These are all things that may take different expressions over time. But yeah, I guess that's what I'd say.
Not to demand that you have idols that remain unkilled, but do you have any sort of people, I guess, known or otherwise, who've kind of helped you along the way with your
Absolutely.
with your beliefs?
I'm a big history nerd, so I think I owe a lot to Emma Goldman and Harriet Tubman in particular in terms of like historical figures who are important for me. I think there's some theory people who I find who were important early on. Alfredo Bonanno, the Italian autonomist author, Deleuze and Guattari, which I know is like not a very popular thing to say these days, I guess, but I don't know, maybe it is. I don't know what the status of all that stuff is academically, because I'm not an academic. IRL, there have been lots of people, known, unknown, who I have had the honor to work with and be inspired by. And I think since most of them are still out in the world and struggle today, I won't name them, but they know who they are, and I love and appreciate them. And I still work.
Fair.
The people I still do stuff with today are equally inspiring and important to me.
Makes sense. So first, I guess the obligatory, I'm trying not to say elevator pitch, but like back of the book, I guess. Like, say,
Yeah.
what's your new book
So
about?
the Extended Universe is an attempt to answer the three different questions. One of which is, why are all superhero movies the same? One of which is, why did Disney send lawyers in 2021 to stop the Biden administration from sharing the coronavirus vaccine with the rest of the world? And why do those two questions have the same answer? So it is about the role of intellectual property in shaping our culture and our world and our corporate overlords, and done through a history of Disney and its movies.
And when and sort of where did the idea first come to you
Hmm.
on this
I
book?
mean, I've always been a big movie nerd, I guess, movie fan. I've often, my first writing gigs were about movies. I was getting paid in Blu-rays, which honestly I haven't seen many raises since. And I did a talk in 2019 for someone's class about Endgame, and I don't remember how ended up doing that talk, Avengers Endgame, and that became sort of the first chapter of the book. I was interested in these questions. I was a movie fan. I was sort of watching the franchisization of everything. And I sort of, I wasn't a big MCU fan, but I did like Marvel. I liked X-Men and Spider-Man growing up, not in a massive fan way. I was sort of a Star Wars growing up. I also loved Star Wars. So I had a lot of cultural overlap with these things, and they sort of were loomed large in my life, but I was very alienated from the fandom, and that contradiction also was interesting to me, and I wanted to be able to sort of think about and talk about them in a way that made sense to me.
Who do you imagine the audience for the book is?
I think the audience for the book is probably not, it's not going to convert people who are hardcore Disney adults, but I did talk to
Mm-hmm.
Disney adults when I was writing the book. I interviewed a few of them, and I hope that it can speak to, in a way, I mean, this is such a generic answer, but in a way, it's sort of everyone, because part of what happened is, if you grew up in America, and indeed much of the world, but especially America, over the last 30, 40 years, you grew up with Disney. So I think it is actually I think it's a strangely present and intimate subject for so many people. And so I want it to be accessible. I want it to be accessible by fans. I don't want it to just be an attack on the fans particularly. And I don't think it is. But I also really want people who are interested in culture and movies to push their analysis past. I think there's a reflexive fanishness we have, when we analyze stuff, or we get defensive, or there's a sort of tendency
Mm-hmm.
to justify our enjoyment by arguing that the film was politically interesting, or politically good, or ethically good. I think this is a relatively new development over the last 5 years that has a lot to do with social
Mm-hmm.
media, the breakdown of regular modes of critical discourse, and also everyone needing to sort of stake out positions and stake takes. And so I think a lot of times we raise the stakes of the discussion of culture while actually lowering the possibilities of what we can actually think through with it, and what we can use it for. So I sort of wanted to, I want to both lower the stakes in a certain
Mm-hmm.
way, which is to say, your enjoyment or non-enjoyment of a particular movie doesn't really matter that much, which is why it's fun to argue about, and why it's fun to think with. And also,
Mm-hmm.
when we sort of identify ourselves with these objects, whether it be sort of as fans or in terms of politically, or really analyzing them in this really direct, this really sort of particular way, which again is fun to do. All of these things are fun to do. I'm not a fanish person in general, but I get how that works. I get how fandom works. The point is not to attack the people who are doing that, but to give people a set of tools to sort of push past those two reflexive modes and be able to talk about the culture that shaped us and continues to shape us, and to make better culture that isn't captured by intellectual property law and by these corporations.
So when it comes to Disney, obviously you're talking a great deal about the monolith of Disney and some of the corporate stuff that's happened in the last decade or two. But also, to me, when you're talking about Disney without qualification, people usually kind of mean a Disney adult usually means someone into Disney movies, what we think of as Disney story and animation and stuff. I don't know if there's anything you can sort of elaborate on as sort of the difference between the behemoth of Disney that now owns Marvel, Star Wars, everything on Earth, and Disney as the sort of the park and the movies you probably watched as a kid and stuff,
Yeah.
and how sort of one influences the other as a PR thing, if that makes
Yeah, I mean, I
sense.
think what's important to understand about Disney is that distinction that we make reflexively that you're talking about, right? When you talk about Disney, you're talking about the
Hmm.
movies. So on the one hand, this book is almost exclusively about the movies. When I started writing it, I was like, I'm going to have a chapter about the theme parks. I'm going to have a chapter about the Disney Channel. I'm going to have a chapter about, I was sort of like looking at, and it's just such a massive corporation that it didn't make sense to actually do that. Like that was not actually within this. I mean, this book is already overstuffed as it is, just talking about the movies and the history of the movie studio.
Hmm.
But I think what's important to note is that division is one of the things that Disney has been really good at producing, is the division between those things. But in fact, there's a concept the early Disney team, by early I mean in the 50s and 60s, used to talk about, called total
Hmm.
marketing. And there really isn't actually a clean distinction between them, but because of the affect that's produced very intentionally, both by the movies and by the theme parks, we tend to think of the image of the sort of magic kingdom, this thing for children, this sort of like magical stories, these fairy tales. And that's actually very much not what Disney is or has been for a very long time. Two examples, and then we can go ahead, but like, so when we think about the classical Disney, we think about the movies from the 30s and 40s. But the moment that Disney really became the corporate powerhouse it is today, then it was just a sort of also ran movie studio. Like it did well, but it was like it wasn't one of the majors. Is when Disneyland opens. But when Disneyland opens after Walt Disney creates the most popular television show and the literally longest running in history. It is still, the Wonderful World of Disney is still technically running to this day. It took a year off in 2018. It is from the very first year television existed to the present, has been running. There no
Hmm.
film, unless it will take 60 years after that movie goes off the air for anything else to catch up. Um, and the way that worked was that the Wonderful World of Disney was the killer app for TVs. When we think about early TV, we often think about I Love Lucy, right? These early sitcoms. But Walt Disney was the other major thing. And when the corporation started actually focusing on children, which it hadn't done until then. Anyway, so Walt Disney gets on TV, he gets on ABC, he has this show. The show is wildly popular. It has like a series called of Davy Crockett. You probably still know the Davy Crockett theme song if you have any boomers in your life, because they would sing it. The Davy Crockett show,
Hmm.
yeah,
I think
exactly.
my mom
The
has.
Davy Crockett
Yep.
movie was so popular that there was a nationwide run on coonskin hats. They ran out. I think I mentioned that in the book. But yeah. But the other thing that he's doing in the TV show is every hour he's talking about the opening of Disneyland. So on the first ever television program, hit TV program, is also an hour-long advertisement for Disneyland. So that when Disneyland opens, again in California, it's sort of already a surefire, like a sure hit, right? This level of integration of the corporation has always been part of the project. And if we look
Hmm.
at 2018, which was the year that Disney probably had the best year any movie company will ever have in the movies, they took, I think it's $1.1 billion in box office just from 10 movies. They made 33% of the, I mean, they are just really naked cash grabs.
Yeah.
They're often advertisements for Disney's technology. They're extremely cynical, right? But the thing is, if you liked, I don't know, Alien Earth, that TV series recently, if you liked Zach Cregger's Barbarian, there's still lots of stuff that we find artistically resonant that's coming out of Disney. But
Hmm.
even jumping to before they acquired Fox, right? Okay, before they acquired 20th Century Fox or 21st Century, I guess. The 90s, like those cartoons were absolutely like the height of a certain kind of animation, like both technologically, right? They're integrating early CGI and early computer editing, which explodes their color palette, but they're still doing mostly 2D cell shaded. I mean, they're beautiful. They're visually beautiful. There's no doubt about it. They have a lot of talent from Broadway. They're particularly Howard Ashman, rest in peace, the gay man who put all of the beautiful queer under and sometimes overtones in those early 90s Disney Renaissance movies. So I don't think there's any doubt that, in my mind, that qualitatively I would rather watch those than some of the output. But the other thing that happened is that Pixar sort of took over the mantle of Disney's place where good fantasies were made. And the thing that
Right.
we can easily forget about the 90s, and this is something that Disney is very good at doing, that is making us forget nostalgically these things, is that there were, for every Disney Renaissance movie, there were 2 or 3 straight to VHS sequels that were absolute garbage, just absolute
Right,
garbage.
of course.
There was, I mean, there's a Lion King Broadway show. There were, the Lion, I think the Lion King video game was like pretty popular, but they are video game tie-ins. Like, there's always been this proliferation of garbage around the flagship movies. It's just that the flagship movies for Disney over the last decades have been either Pixar or Marvel, right? And it hasn't actually been the Disney
Hmm.
animation has not been at the center of Disney's product. But I think people, if you ask people now, like people who grew up, maybe 10 years after us or 20 years after us, like those Pixar movies are just as important, and so is Frozen, and they still pull it off from time to time. And I think their total monopoly and their total power. Like, I argue that they killed the movies. Like, I do think it's been a disaster for movies what their story style has been. I do think it has lowered the average quality of movies in general at the cinema. But Disney was just the leading force among a pack of movie studios that were all moving in the same directions around intellectual property, franchisation, streaming, all these things.
Can you talk a little bit more about sort of everything turning into franchises, I guess? Because talking about I'm blanking on the terminology, I think you probably said it, where there's a video
Right.
game, there's a park, there's a this and that. Sort of how that's like franchises in general, like there is never a
Yeah.
single, there's a single piece of art, it seems
Hmm.
rarer and rarer.
Franchises go back, all the way to sort of the early days of novels, right? Sherlock Holmes is a franchise, right? James Bond is a franchise. So it's not that it's a totally new concept. There were these movies in the 30s. There were this genre of movies called serials, which would be the same character would have an hour long three reeler, an hour long adventure, and it would be part of a double feature, and you'd have your favorite. So this stuff has all existed for a long time, but for the most part, with the exception of Sherlock Holmes and James Bond, the movie industry and Hollywood just considered franchising something that was kids stuff, right? So you had it with Mickey Mouse, you had these sort of iconic characters, but they thought that because they believe in their constant ageism, that kids are like stupid and they're different from people, right? And they're easier to market to, or they're easier to dupe or whatever. So they sort of believed incorrectly that only kids would go in for that. And that sort of really comes apart in the late 70s with the emergence of Star Wars. So one of the things about Star Wars that's really important is that George Lucas, one of the ways he gets it funded is that he agrees to take no profits and a pretty small salary, but he gets to keep the rights, the intellectual property rights, to all the characters and everything and the images. And at the time, these were considered junk rights. This is how they were referred to in Hollywood. And he has been an incredibly rich man ever since, right? Merchandising rights. So he sort of proves, to some extent, and then there's other transformations that trace it in the book towards the blockbuster model, but basically it's just been accelerating and accelerating, and there's a number of reasons why what has happened with franchisation has happened. Part of it is that as the movie studios, none of the movie studios are really movie studios first and foremost anymore, none of the major ones. They are all diversified conglomerate corporate structures, right? All of them are trying to sell music and books and whatever else, merchandise and all this stuff. And that's been the case since the 90s, like since the 80s, really, the deregulation of the FCC, the deregulation of media that happened under Reagan, and again, and continued under Clinton, to be clear, like sort of allowed this sort of reemergence of these big cross-media monopolies. So they had all these other places to make money. But again, Disney was ahead of the curve on that because they had the theme park. So Disney was already, by the time Disneyland opens, Disney is no longer primarily a movie studio. It's movie studios, and it would remain a very small
Mhm.
percentage of their business, except for like a brief moment in the 90s when those movies are so successful that like they become a major part again. Um, but basically, like
Mhm.
this tendency towards franchise has a lot to do with a conception of movies as investment. It has a lot to do with finance capital, because movies famously, at least through the 80s, were famously unreliable. They were gambles, right? Like investing in a movie was a sucker's play,
Hmm.
right? If you weren't in a studio, like studios were largely just like producers were largely people who were getting better and better at gambling on like which kind of movies were good, and even still they're big flops and you get stuff wrong, right? And it's like it's a famously mercurial and difficult business. And what IP does is they refer to it in the business as tickets are pre-sold. So, for example, if you want me to go to a wholly new sci-fi movie, right? Like the totally new concept, you have to prove to me that it looks interesting. You have to maybe connect it to some talent I like. You need to show me good images, and you need to do that 3 or 4
Hmm.
times before the movie comes out, right? That's like a
Hmm.
big, expensive push, a marketing push. If you're adapting a franchise I already like, I'm paying attention to my own volition. I'm probably going to go no matter what the reviews are, right? I'm probably going to go see it anyway because I'm a fan. I'm going to know which of my friends I'd want to like invite with me to go to that particular movie, right? There's just this idea that it sort of you have a pre-sold audience, and it doesn't mean they don't spend money on marketing, because they do. They spend oodles of money on marketing, because the other thing is it's not about saving money. Expense in the movies is not a problem anymore. What is nice about IP is that it makes it a reliable return on investment. So even if your movie flops in the US, because of the way that that US cultural imperialism and domination controls world markets, because of the way that the American film industry is so much more powerful and makes better stuff than the rest of the world, movies start to have a guaranteed return, more or less. You're going to get your money back from a movie, which means people will invest as much money as they possibly can into it, because it's a way to keep it liquid, right? To roll over, to get profits, and to not have to pay taxes on it, right? So there's lots of reasons you want to have a liquid asset if you're a capitalist, and I don't claim to understand most of them. Um, I do not have any capital myself, but so there's this sort of confluence of factors, right? And as you can tell, the things I've just named, very few of them are artistic or cultural, right? These are business
Right.
tendencies. There's also the fact that IP protection gives you a lot of power, and when you're managing an IP as an executive, you have way more creative control over the product than the people who are actually making it, right? So the history of media production and cultural production is a struggle between the who gets to define the images and who gets to make them. And IP is a powerful tool in the hands of the executives, because they get to make the next movie. They get to like shape the franchise. They're sort of owning this like pre-built world of stories. And so directors, screenwriters, actors, people who used to be important to the way a movie got made can become more interchangeable hired guns.
I was trying not to go off on a tangent from that, but now, extremely specifically, I'm immediately thinking of like not being a huge comic book person necessarily. Like, it's my understanding that something like Guardians of the Galaxy obviously wasn't existing IP, but I would say it was like a sort
Mm-hmm.
of maybe third tier, like intellectual property product, and that was a big old success. I'm just wondering if there's still a modicum of risk when you're so sort of able to take every property possible that your average person who definitely knows who Superman and Batman are has probably not heard of. And when you have a success with that, I don't know if there's sort of the guarantee kind of thing that you're talking about seems less
Well, that's
clear to
that's
me there.
precisely it. Is that what franchisation allows is for something like the MCU to turn what is, you know, B tier. And remember, the MCU had to build itself without having access to Spider-Man or the X-Men, right? Who are I mean, Spider-Man eventually
Right,
came in,
yeah.
but who are by far and away the most powerful and popular Marvel characters, right? But
Hmm.
it's the concept of being pre-sold is something that the producers talk about. But if you look at some of the stuff that's getting IP adaptations now, it's not the main thing going on, right? That's the justification that they offer. Um, but like, they're
Okay.
making IP product out of, I mean, I talked to someone in the book. I talked to a person in the book a screenwriter, who was told, who had this original screenplay. shopped it around. No one was interested. And her agent told her, write this as a short story, publish it in a magazine,
Mhm.
then sell the screenplay as based on that short story. Now, obviously, that's not like gonna be a bit. There is
Yeah.
a sort of compulsive and sort of like close-minded aspect to the way IP now functions, right? Where it's like become really an obsession for Hollywood producers, or at least it had when I was doing the research for the book. Stuff changes fast, but so I don't think it's about necessarily the quality of the IP exactly. However, the fact that stuff is in the Marvel universe and that still does have fans, like, does matter, right? If Guardians of the Galaxy had not been connected
Mhm.
to Marvel in some way, they wouldn't have been able to either get the funding to make that budget that big, nor been able to sell people on the idea, because the building of the Avengers and the building of the whole arc of the MCU is really important to all of those movies' sales. And like, now we're seeing a lot of them flop, right? MCU is not working that well anymore. Superheroes are sort of out
Mhm.
of favor. They're making less and less money. They're canceling shows on Disney Plus. Like, so it's not a perfect infinite strategy, right? Forever. Like, there's still
Mhm.
mercurial. The audiences are still mercurial. But if you think about Barbie, like the Barbie movie, like when I remember when Pirates of the Caribbean first came out, and that was in the 2000s, there were a lot of jokes. Oh, it's a
Mhm.
movie based on a theme park ride, right? There's no other IP there, and it worked, right? And now people barely even talk about Barbie as like a corporate shill for Mattel, right? So I guess like what I'm trying to say is that like there's a certain kind of name recognition and brand recognition that can sort of transcend the actual quality of the product. It doesn't really matter, right? As long as something is sort of recognizable, it doesn't need to have a super big fan base, because all the stuff that has a super big fan base has already been pumped thousands of times at this point, right? Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about sort of the concept of like genre and fandom becoming extremely like mainstream at one point, and sort of how corporations have responded to and kind of cultivated that? The San Diego Comic Con was once, it's called a Comic Con, but for like 2 decades now, you've had sort of almost anything, any vaguely genre, which was always kind of a bullshit word
Totally.
anyway. I don't know, it's not really very helpful. But just sort of fandom. I mean, we have this sort of distracting debates about toxicity of fandoms, but also maybe Gamergate destroyed the
Totally.
society,
Yeah.
you
No,
know?
it,
Like,
it
I
did.
don't know.
It was certainly a major factor. I think, I
Mhm.
think that I have a few chapters about sort of how fandom works in the book. And it's not sort of the main thing that I
Mhm.
focus on, but I think part of the way that fandom operates has been the collapse of the monoculture, right? Of the sort of like, what we sort of had from I don't know, I guess the 50s to the 90s, right? Where sort of everyone was watching sort of the same stuff, everyone was engaged in the same ideas. The collapse of that has made that like people sort of split off into silos, which like produces more fandoms. You also have the collapse
Mhm.
of the traditional critical apparatus, right? So not just newspaper critics, although newspaper critics, but like any of the sort of normal ways that people got information about stuff have been replaced by influencers and by social media, right? So social media encourages us
Mhm.
to identify with the things that we like. It becomes a brand because we have this sort of public facing account that is our brand, or our, whatever it is we do, is content that is branded by us, right? And all of these things increase the tendency towards fandom. They don't give birth to it. Fandom is as old as the movies, or at least as Hollywood, as old as Hollywood.
Mhm.
There are major fan magazines in the 20s and 30s. There is a moral panic about fandoms in the 30s, since they're mostly women, and whenever women are doing something, especially young women, there's a moral panic about it. So there's
Of
like,
course.
there's a long history there, and I really don't want to like just like totally override it. But I think part of what has happened is that as monoculture has collapsed, as other forms of community have collapsed in America, at least, fandom is a way that we like both can find people who we relate to and relate with through these sort of alienated products that otherwise we interact with largely alone. And fandoms allow us also
Right.
to produce a lot of creative expression, fan fiction, right, being the obvious example. And so
Mhm.
fandoms offer something that is missing in our lives, which is maybe what used to be being in a union or being in some sort of social organization or living in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other or working in a factory
Right.
where everyone worked the same place for 10 years, right? You had a real community there. As life has become more precarious and more disjointed as a result of capital responding to the revolutions and near-revolutions of the 1960s and 70s. Fandom has emerged as
Mhm.
a way for community to form because we always want to form communities. And that has, I think, raised the stakes on the meaning of culture for people, right? Because it's their identity, it's their
Mhm.
home, and that can be, I mean, that can be Gamergate, that can be, brigading harassment, that can be the recruiting grounds for the fascist movement, but it can also be,
Right.
a subculture, a subcultural space where people meet each other and build beautiful things together. The thing about fandom that I think leans it right in general is the relationship between the person and the object, the fan and the object, right? Which is that there's a hierarchy between them necessarily, right? And that is often overcome
Right.
through
Yeah.
things like fan fiction. That is overcome through conventions. That's overcome through can be overcome through those things. It can be overcome through cosplay or tabletop role playing
Yeah.
or role playing in general. There's lots of ways that
Right.
this can be overcome, and it's not flat, but there is a relation of power in a fandom between the object and its fans that either has to be actively sort of overcome, dismantled, or subverted, but which I think leads towards a kind of loyalty and traditionality that has turned them into pretty ripe spaces for takeover by right-wing forces. Even though, if you look at those fandoms and the fandom debates, the far right folks in them tend to be well organized but minority, right? They're not actually that many of them. But I think that the structure of fandom spaces allows those people to make a lot of arguments that people who otherwise wouldn't fuck with a right wing argument can understand because they talk about it in terms of protecting the object of fandom.
That makes sense. I guess I want to know how sort of your average well-meaning normie person maybe ideally should interact with these giant things, and how someone more like you interacts with them in terms of not going through life unable to enjoy anything ever made by a corporation, but not becoming a part of this
Yeah,
absurd system. What's the right way to
that's
enjoy stuff?
it's funny. That's of all the questions, everyone wants to ask me that on all the interviews, and that's I think that question is really telling. I think we really feel like we're not allowed to enjoy things culturally. And in
Yeah.
this moment of global catastrophe, both genocidal and ecological, it's understandable that we don't feel a lot of justification in enjoying our lives or enjoying things. And I think that a lot of the way that we think about and talk about culture is justificatory, right? Which is just like it's people trying to justify their own feelings and their enjoyment. But the thing is, we're all made by this world. Yes, like Cheetos are specifically designed by nefarious food scientists to like touch this sort of part of my tongue that touches a certain part of my brain and makes me want to eat more and more of them. They also taste really good, right? And like
Mm,
I was raised
they
on
do.
enjoying that taste. And so I think
Yeah.
what we I think that the answer is to be kinder to ourselves for enjoying the things we enjoy, instead of remonstrating ourselves or feeling shame, which is the sort of, not to bring it back to this, but as a sort of, Protestant relationship to enjoyment, right? Which is that like enjoyment itself is sin. I think
Mhm.
there's a lot of that in there. Um, that's not true. The
Yeah.
Protestants are wrong. But also, and they're boring and creepy, but also, at least the ones who believe that, obviously. But also, I think we need to do that because if we get trapped in this question of how can I accept my enjoyment, we actually have a really hard time giving a good
Mhm.
critique of the object. Because it's like, how can I enjoy this corporate
Mhm.
product? Well, yeah, but everything in our lives is a corporate product. There are very few things that are non-corporate in our lives. And we should obviously like appreciate those and go for those. And I'm a big believer in telling everyone to make their own culture, to steal, borrow, use whatever you want from Disney, from the intellectual property regime. Be as creative, wild, and as subversive as possible with it. No fear, no regrets. I'm about it. Who cares? Make your stuff and make it beautiful and make it fun. So there's that. But there's also the fact that this flat critique, this is corporate, therefore it is evil. Okay, yes, but that's the baseline. That is not the end of the sentence. That's the baseline. But because we get stuck going,
Right.
how can I like this corporate thing? We never get past that critique. What is it doing? How is it making its pleasure? How is it failing its pleasure? How is it reminding you that it's corporate? What is the ideology present here? What is it doing? How we can't, when we pay attention to ourselves and our own relation in that way, it is harder to pay attention to what the culture is actually doing and what it actually means and what it's actually about and how we might actually subvert it. So this is very abstract, I appreciate, because I think it's a complicated thing. But I think we have to accept our enjoyment. We have to embrace our bodies and our pleasures where we can find them. We have to not recoil in fear or horror or disgust when something catches our eye. We have to be honest about it, think about it, interrogate it, talk about it, be vulnerable about it, with ourselves at least, at the very least, and not worry about what other people are going to think about what we think about this thing.
So before I move more into IP, because there's some absurd stuff there, now I kind of want to ask, talking about the difficulty in enjoying stuff. So I don't think it exists anymore, but I remember a time when Bitch magazine seemed very novel because it was overly critiquing pop culture. It was, a few feminist blogs and stuff would do that. And suddenly, in the last, 10, 15 to 20 years, like that sort of overthinking, in quotes, became a lot more normalized, and sort of people talk about, corporate like pandering, checking boxes of diversity and stuff. Like the corporations are vaguely responding to this idea that like people want something to be more morally good in its way. I feel like this is a change that I kind of dimly remember now, that when it wasn't quite like this.
Yes, no, I think that's exactly right. I think when we grew up, I'm just assuming we're of similar ages. When we grew up, the tenor of criticism was largely like Consumer Reports. Is it good? Is it bad? Should you buy it? Should you not? And so stuff emerged. The magazine, The New Inquiry, which I was part of, was actually part of this, of like, let's actually take this stuff seriously. Let's read it seriously for what it is, right? I think Bitch magazine is another good example. And in some ways, that was really just a return to like a culture of criticism that was previously present, right? That had sort of in the 80s and 90s been washed away under the sort of like, oh, it's just pop, it's just garbage, who cares? Why would you even talk about it seriously? And now we have we've overcorrected from that, I think, right? And we take everything so seriously, and like everything is like so, and like the stakes are so high and so personal, and everything is so meaningful, and the way that you interpret it is almost more important than the way that it actually functions, or your enjoyment at all doesn't really matter. And yeah, then you have this sort of concomitant thing going on that you're talking about, of like a lot of that sort of diversity pandering stuff was in response to social struggle, right? More than anything else, right? That was in response to the decade of struggle, that from 2011 to 2020, right? And a lot of the demands there were brought in precisely because they were effectively changing culture, and there were campaigns that were effectively changing the culture industry as well, directly, from both internally and externally. So those two tendencies happen together, and now we're at this place again and there was also sort of this collapsing wall of marketing versus criticism versus editorial versus journalism, right? And all of those things have collapsed into like sort of this one big mush. It's like, is the video sponsored? Even if the video itself isn't sponsored, are the ads around it for the very thing it's advertising, right? How is the money being made? It's all black box. There's all these forces that make make the way that culture is talked about and consumed both more profitable and more integrated with advertisement. And so I think that like all of that is obviously pretty bleak. It's not good,
Mm-hmm.
but it does lead to a lot more difficulty in separating some of those questions in a meaningful way. And so I guess what I'm trying to do with the book is to offer some modes of thinking through that conundrum, by recognizing, ironically, by recognizing just how integrated all that stuff is, and not trying to reassert these dead categories, right? Like this is advertisement and this is editorial, right? Like that's gone.
Mm-hmm.
It's materially gone. It is like does not exist. It no longer benefits capital. Like it's not around anymore. Instead of trying to reassert those sort of dead forms that never really served us anyway, right? That just served us corporate product anyway. We need to have a new way of interacting and thinking with culture that builds our autonomy, both in terms of criticism, but also in terms of our own cultural production.
Okay, so all of that is good. It's interesting. Okay, but now we need to shock the people and talk a little bit about the whole COVID Disney lawyer thing, which I swear to God I missed that.
It was a small story. Not a lot. It didn't get a lot of coverage at the time. But yes, in 2021, the COVID vaccine, which had been completed and deployed, was going up for this thing called the TRIPS waiver, which is a part of the World Trade Organization's policy around intellectual property rights, which would mean, and it was designed for just this sort of a scenario, in a global crisis, the global community would agree to waive the patent rights on the vaccine so that it could be produced everywhere, right? And this didn't include COVID treatments, right? This didn't include diagnostics. This was literally just the vaccines. And the
Mm-hmm.
pharmaceutical lobby and the sent 100 lobbyists to try and stop this from happening. And Disney, as part of the MPAA, and along with the RIAA, which is the Record Association, recording industry,
Right.
they sent 5 lobbyists. So nothing compared to pharma, but they sent lobbyists to argue that this should not be shared with the world because of an operative legal theory that functions around most of the industries now, that any threat to intellectual property rights, even one that is technically legally within the global trade system, is a sort of slippery slope snowball towards the total collapse. Now, I think what's shocking about it is that if we think about movie production, or even if we think about theme parks, it's so obvious that COVID is a disaster for Disney, right? Everything shut down. They couldn't make things. No one could go there. So it seems extremely counterintuitive that they would actually want to slow the process of vaccine dispersal, right? From any sort of
Yeah.
like basic bottom line concept, if you think about them as a corporation that is largely making movies or even just largely theme parks, but they're an intellectual property protection corporation. That's what they do. And as a result,
Yeah.
they act the same as pharmaceutical companies, and they act the same as fast fashion companies, and they act the same as software companies, all of whom are deeply, deeply invested in the maintenance of the US in particular, but the global WTO in general, system of copyright and intellectual property protection, because it's the only thing that makes their garbage valuable.
I don't know why I was so shocked that like Disney dipped its toes directly into an issue involving uh a disease. Like I knew that I knew about their kind of behavior with I'm artificially separating like
Yeah.
patents and intellectual property and like right now, but like it seems like it should have been such horrible PR for them, and yet I didn't even notice when it happened. I'm
Yeah, no, I
still
mean,
kind
and
of
that's
shocked.
everyone I talked to was shocked about it. I mean, it's shocking. I was shocked the first time I saw it, and I was writing the cynical book about it.
Yeah,
It is shocking in a certain way, and that's part of the victory of Disney as a corporation, is to make us think of
yeah,
them as something other than what they are.
yeah. I feel like this is coming directly from spending too much time on Blue Sky, full of panic liberals who are scared of LLMs and stuff. I don't know. I almost want to ask you to like steal man intellectual property, but that seems silly. Tell the imaginary
Right,
liberals, the small artists and stuff, why sort of this is all tied together, and maybe you can't have just a sprinkle of
right.
IP. It doesn't
I mean,
seem to go that way.
I think it makes sense that in the landscape that we work in, and as artists, as creatives, as content producers, it makes sense that we are so often exploited. Our shit is stolen by these big corporations, by these big accounts.
Mhm.
It's so consistent and constant. It's so easy for them to do it that, of course, it feels like that would be our only protection, right? Because that's what they claim it is meant to
Yeah.
do. But I think AI really puts paid to that whole thing, because what we've seen is that the big AI companies more or less have gone out on the world stage and said, yep, we stole all this copyrighted material. Yep, we did that. Disney is one of the only Fortune 500. So when you join the Fortune 500, or when you list publicly, you don't have to be in the Fortune 500. When you list publicly
Hmm.
with the SEC, one of the things you have to do in your financial reporting is report who your top 5 paid officers are in your corporation. Disney is one of the only corporations in the Fortune
Okay.
500 where a top legal officer is in the top 5 every time, right? They are a
Ooh.
legal, they're a law firm
Okay.
as much as they're anything else, Disney. So Disney could have
Hmm.
nuked this shit from orbit, right? This is a slam dunk case,
Hmm.
right? Open, they're in the New York Times saying I stole Disney's copyright, right? Like, I mean, it's not, there's nothing there for
Yeah.
them to defend themselves on.
Yeah.
They didn't, because they don't care about copying. Copying is not what copyright is about. What copyright is about maintaining the power of the owners of the intellectual property. And they see AI as a
Hmm.
tool, LLMs, as a tool that is going to increase their power as the executives over the creatives. So the only lawsuit that Disney has engaged in was with a competitor AI company from theirs, right? And they're developing the AI technology. I mean, people don't know about Disney's
Yeah.
venture capital fund. The GoPro is a Disney invention, not something many people know about. Yeah, yep.
Didn't know
So
that either.
there's just this idea that intellectual property is sort of defense of the little guy. But if you look at the history of copyright cases, artists who have successfully won tend to already be very big and powerful artists. And for the most part, copyright law
Hmm.
is like criminal justice law or like any other form of law, a way that the powerful and well lawyered can maintain their position of power against the other people in cultural and economic forums. There is there's a circuit, the fifth, I think it's the fifth. So the fifth is the Hollywood circuit. Whatever appeals court it is that where Hollywood, most of the Hollywood trials end up, is often referred to cynically as the Hollywood Court of Appeals, because something that happens all the time when screenwriters pitch their movies, they will sort of go, they'll take a lot of meetings with producers, and they'll say, "Here's my idea," and then, as often happens, because
Hmm.
it's a dirty, dirty business, they'll pitch it. The producers will say, "We're not that interested. Sorry, we're not that interested." The person will go away. A week later, in Variety, there's an announcement. Paramount funds the exact plot of the movie you just pitched them, right? And so those people would take the studios to court,
Yeah.
and every single time, the court would throw it out because it was just a generic idea and it wasn't close enough. They couldn't prove it
Right.
every time. If there is no justice for us there. There is no protection for us there. There are occasionally situations where it works to our advantage, either by accident or because other forces align with us in the right way. And that is it's
Hmm.
not to deny that that's possible or that some people sometimes can get victories out of it, but it is much more common, and by much more I mean 99.9% of the time, copyright is going to be used to strike down your YouTube video rather than to
Right.
protect your drawing.
I mean, I think you're totally right. I still see so much just like fear that if you don't jump in the pool of IP, you will get even less than nothing. Sort of, if
Mm.
you're not, if you're not becoming a part of this, then you can't protect the little thing that you have. But I don't really know how to reassure people on that. I feel like anti IP is still an incredibly minority position within.
Culture industry. Yeah, no, it is. It is. It's a minority position.
Yeah.
It's a minority
Yeah.
position because it used to be a bigger thing, and then you had sort of the copy left movement, right? And you had sort of Creative Commons, and you had these sort of open copyright things that were sort of very
Right.
like sort of reforms of the system that were designed to sort of allow another way. And I guess I just ask, like, are you making lots of money on your art? Like, is that happening for you? Like, who like, I don't understand, like, I guess maybe there's like a small middle class of people who feel like it successfully protects them. I don't know. I mean,
Maybe,
I
yeah.
believe in them in theory, but I tend to just hear people say this is the only protection I have, and those are people who are complaining about getting ripped off. It's like, well, you've just been ripped off, because
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know about you, I don't have the funds to bring a lawsuit. So it doesn't really matter,
No,
like
not
if
at the
someone
moment.
steals, you know what I mean? Like I don't have that kind of power already, and maybe some folks do, and maybe there are edge cases, but I think like if we just look at the world as it is now, how does the culture industry work now compared to how it did 40 years ago? Well, 40 years ago, the IP regime was way weaker. The IP regime covered a lot less. It lasted
Hmm.
a lot less long. It had less brutal penalties. Are little producers better protected than they were in the 70s? Like absolutely not. You know, things are worse for artists than they ever have been, or not ever, never have been. Things are worse for artists than they have been since probably the WPA forums in the 30s, right? Being a sort of turning point, and the sort of the unionization of a lot of the creative industries at that point. We just don't. We're in a bad situation, and the thing that has chipped away at our independence, our capacity, and our rights is the intellectual property system. If you find an opportunity to use it in a way that could help you, like for example that Anthropic lawsuit, like if you can get some money out of Anthropic because they stole your book, I support that. Get
Hmm.
that cash, babe. No problem. It's not about a moral failing as an
Yeah.
individual. We have to struggle on the ground in which we find ourselves, but defending the system of IP in general is you're caping. It's like defending the tobacco industry. You are caping for the system that
Yeah.
produces agricultural monocrop cultures that are extremely susceptible to total
Right.
failure. You're producing vaccine apartheid when you protect IP. You're protecting all of these horrendous things. And maybe there is a reasonable way to try and argue that there's still something valuable about the system. I think all property should be abolished. And I don't think that we could just abolish IP tomorrow and that would be the revolution, which is often, I think, how these people tend to sort of
Hmm.
think or talk about it, right? Is like, well, if you took that away, what would we have? It's like, well, yeah, if you had like a magic genie, if you had a Thanos glove and you snapped and only took away IP, like that would be a foolish thing to
Hmm.
do. Like that's not the method. But that's not how anything works in the world. I'm begging people to you know,
Yeah.
understand the deep interconnection of culture, industry. I just
Yeah.
like all of this stuff is so deeply entwined. Get the bag. We live in a bad world. If you can make it as an artist, make it and figure out how you can do that. But I just don't see a lot of flourishing artists right now under this regime. I don't have a lot of examples. I have a lot of
Yeah.
examples of people saying copyright protects me, but I haven't seen a lot of examples of successful
Hmm.
lawsuits of copyright actually protecting people.
And there are, just the most wonderfully horrible example anecdotes like, uh, maybe it wasn't Disney at the time, but suing like to stop someone from putting Spider-Man on like their dead child's grave because they
Right.
love Spider-Man, like,
Mm-hmm.
or like Disney, I believe, doing something with a daycare that painted Mickey Mouse on their
Yep.
walls. Like
Yep.
there are some insane anecdotes that
Disney
are
sued
are somewhat known, but probably not enough.
Disney sued a French AIDS charity in the height of the AIDS crisis because they used a parodic Snow White image in one of their campaigns. They sued an AIDS charity.
I mean, parody
They would have,
parody's
and
supposed
this
to be
is
a little
exactly
bit
this is
protected. I
exactly the
mean, I
thing about
thought,
IP. They
but
probably would have won the case, but you can't afford to go to court with Disney.
right, right,
You
yeah.
can't afford to go to court with Disney, even if you're right.
Um,
Even if you would win, you can't do it. You can't afford it.
would you, be at all supportive of sort of any kind of social version of IP, like a stigma against, um, I don't know, if I like took your book and wrote by Lucy Steigerwald, like that should be frowned upon, I would say,
And it
because
already
that's
is. It
ridiculous.
already is, right? I mean,
But on
I'm
the
not worried about that. Yeah, yeah. It's
it
frowned
really
upon.
is. It is.
I'm not worried about the reason that copyright. It feels like we need to protect it is because we need to make money off of our art.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to make money off our art because we
Right.
live under capitalism and we have to pay to live inside and we have to pay to eat. But if that wasn't an issue, we would not reflexively defend copyright. And we wouldn't even really be worried about people, copying our stuff or like even stuff like plagiarism, like, which again, like there's problems with it and there's real issues, but that has to do with just like levels of power and access to resources. And if everyone has equal access to resources and everyone has equal access to community, then the threat of copying the stakes of it become very different, right? It becomes about cultural capital, it becomes
Right.
about feeling respected, it comes about feeling disrespected, which matters. That stuff matters. But it's not a survival question at that point.
I would say there's definitely going to be some artistic ego involved, which to me, I haven't done any journalism lately, but I used to dabble more. The idea of writing with an LLM at all, like the ego balks at that because I didn't do that. So if you take my article and put your name on it, there's an ego
Yes.
outrage to me that obviously is tied to money now, but I imagine even in a better world, I would still be like, hey,
Yes.
that's
Yes.
mine. I feel a sense of property a bit over it, but maybe if it was a neutered, sort of timid property that didn't have much effect beyond my ego, we could keep it.
And what the state demands is that if you have that feeling, that you send armed agents to deal with the problem. Like, and that's just
Yep.
not like, yes, I mean, I also have that feeling from time to time. Hey, that's like, hey, I think that's my idea in there and I'm not referenced. Like that feels not great.
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah.
But like, also like, I don't know, like the stakes for that, like that's a conflict that we can have between people as part of a community. And like
Yeah.
that's a conflict that like abolishing property will not make conflict go away, right? What it will do is it will make it impossible for one person to win a conflict by having the other person made destitute or murdered, right? Like by the state. And also, for so long, the other thing is that the very concept of the author only emerges in the mid 19th century. The creative
Right.
author
Yeah.
who like produces everything their own, right? I mean, like, everyone's talking about the Odyssey right now, right? Homer is an amalgamation of people that's an oral tradition, right? Homer is the guy who writes it down, probably not even a guy, right? Like one guy. And like that's not just like the sands of time, like we forget. Like, no, like, I mean, there's some of that there, but like it's also just the fact that like the concept of authorship and of the individual as the author, like just like music, right? Music used to like popular music was just played by everyone around, and songs were not like the original creation mostly of the bards who went around singing them, right? And without recording, like all music was sort of in this sort of, and there's lots of problems. There's like, again, the point isn't to like be like, and everything was perfect and culture was great and it was not susceptible to capitalism. Yeah. Like that's not the argument I'm making. I'm just saying that it's actually a shockingly recent idea that like this is my idea and it's my particular idea and I put my name on it and then everyone has to respect that. That is like 150-year-old concept, and there's a lot of literature and a lot of art before that concept really emerges. And a lot of the stuff that we think about and talk about is like retroactive. Like we look back and apply the way we think about it to the way that artists were working in the past, but it's just not the case, as with so many things. So, all of which is to say, there are many, many other models in which cultural production would actually lead to a life of flourishing. I also think everyone should be doing more. People should have more time to pursue creative things, to pursue their art and their cultural production. And I think that even at its very best, even at its most, Pollyanna-ish positive description, what copyright does is it makes it possible to produce art for a capitalist market, by intervention of the state.
And it's not always Disney or like one cartoonist, but like Shakespeare got his stuff from Greek stuff, and Shakespeare is now like the ultimate writer that anyone's ever heard of. There is sort of like wavering standards of what is okay. Sometime in the last year or whatever, I saw something where Elvis Costello was asked about some song that Olivia Rodrigo made that apparently has something
Uh-huh.
that sounds like a song he did. And they were like, "Are you mad about this?" And he was like, "No, because I kind of got that little riff from Bob Dylan, and
Exactly.
Bob Dylan got it from that guy." And sort of like, and there is something really nice about that idea. I mean,
We create nothing alone. We are not lone geniuses sitting in our garrets producing things from nothing. If you the only thing that is common among writers is they all read a ton, right? Which means they're absorbing these ideas, they're thinking it out. Like none of us act alone. We all produce this work together in ways that like are really beautiful, as you're pointing to. It's a really beautiful thing about us. It's a beautiful thing about culture is that it's instantly and infinitely reproducible and infinitely iterable, and that we can always play with and change and use each other's ideas. That's a beautiful thing.
it is. And I don't think it's totally in opposition to, again, having your little ego boost of an artist's name on something. It can still be your version of the thing. Like, I love one of the best things that America ever did was, have a folk and country tradition. And there are certain, like, song staples that you can see how they changed. Maybe they came from England, or they came from a big question mark, and like the lyrics will change a little bit in that version and this version. You can find out whose version is what, who recorded it this way, but it's still like Stagger Lee or something, and it's like the 57th version, but it's that guy's version, and it's a lot more dynamic that way, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah, and having that
I don't know.
history, the only reason we have most of that history, right, is that project, again, not to go back to WPA, right, but where those guys went around recording all those folk songs and blues songs from guys who were dying out. So
Oh
you
yeah.
only have that generation, but who knows how many generations back they go, right? And like so many of those songs probably go back to Africa, right? And were brought over in the hold of the slave
Mm-hmm.
ship and remembered and sung and resung as like a mode of liberation and freedom. And then copyright exists to come and take that and turn it into profit for white record companies.
Yeah, I mean, you can easily go to that again and say, well, like, most of the guys going around collecting songs, I mean, there can be exceptions, but I'm thinking of white guys collecting from
Yep.
black guys and black women and stuff. And there is like a power dynamic thing, but I mean, certain things exist because that sort of thing was done. Like A.P. Carter from the Carter family had a black friend who taught him guitar, and he went around collecting songs, and that guy has a much shorter Wikipedia page than the white
Exactly.
A.P.
Exactly.
Carter. Like, there is a power thing, I guess, that you can get almost overly bogged down in, but then, as you've said, that doesn't mean you should bet your money on the state
Right. And well,
enforcement
and
as
the
the
other thing is
answer.
that um, those guys who go around and record it as a sort of as a tribute to the music form are many many fewer than the record producers in the 50s and 60s who turned them into singles that they gave to other artists, right?
Right.
Like the
Right.
reason I
Yeah.
brought up those guys who go around and saving it is because they were the vast majority of recorded music that was made was still pulling from those standards. They were just stripped of their origins and stolen,
Mm-hmm.
and in those instances, right, they use copyright and legal uh, structures, but to trick blues musicians into giving up the stuff like through legal structures, through purely legal means, right? And if you keep going back far enough, it's as you're saying, I think the act of conservation and of cultural conservation is incredibly important and valuable. I think it's a beautiful thing to do with your life. Like I really think it's a cool thing to do. That
Mm-hmm.
rocks. Do that. If that's a thing that like moves you to like to archive and to record, like that's a beautiful thing to do for humanity. Absolutely. But it has nothing to do with copyright. Copyright has no interest in that.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I'm a little too backwards here, but I don't want to go too far down the road of property in general. But you mentioned
Yeah.
being kind of
Yeah.
against property. Now I kind of want like I don't know if I want you to define intellectual property after we just had this whole talk, or define property and sort of what's the issue with it. Either way, would you download a car?
I would. I need a car. I live in a city where you need a car. I would definitely download a car. Not to like plug or whatever, but
Right.
the first book I wrote, In Defense of Looting, goes at great length into sort of how property is formed and what property is in the United States. Property is largely the first forms of property in the United States is indigenous land and the bodies of Black people, Africans. Intellectual property is an idea, a concept, either an invention or a brand, can also like a trademark, is also a form of intellectual property, that you can prove that you created yourself and that the state will protect your right to bring it solo to market for a duration of time based on the law. So that's what IP, intellectual property is it's this, it's a written image, it's a and people sort of talk about this as though it's like really abstract and it's really different from regular forms of property. I don't think that's true. I think that a landlord who owns a building but is never there that's just as abstract an ownership as someone who owns a song but it doesn't have to play it anymore, right? Or has never played it. In the case of sort of an investor, that like all instances of property is a relation of domination. It's a social form of domination. With the backup of the state, one person is allowed to extract value from that object, be it a song, a building, or a factory, or indeed the land of indigenous people or the labor of enslaved Africans. So yeah, I'm against property. That first book's all about it. If you want a full book length argument against property, In Defense of Looting is available on the Anarchist library. You can read it for free, so you don't have to. I'm not asking you to shell out money. And and that's a good place to go.
That is a delightful I don't know, that title makes me want to makes me want to check it out. And as I was Googling you, I saw some of the backlash you got when that book first came out and stuff, which made me want to read it more.
Yeah,
I mean,
there was that was a let's call that an interesting time in my life when that book came out.
I mean, I don't know that I would agree 100% on everything, but I once read a book called, I believe it was Against Free Speech, which is an immediately irritating title to me, but it had some interesting sort of ways of looking at speech and that I hadn't really quite thought of before. So
yeah, maybe I'll convince you on looting. That's the Vicky Osterweil
maybe.
Promise,
I'm still stuck in like a Georgist like off ramp about land being demonstrably different, and obviously some people are like, well, personal property is okay, but so like there are things.
I mean, I think like there have always been conceptions of some kind of this thing is to some degree or other mine, but the definition of what the individual was different, and the definition of what the consequences of that were different under different systems. And I mean, it's just like it's about private capitalist property is like what I'm talking about here, and I think that contra the people who argue that copyright or intellectual property is a really weird version of it, I would say the centrality of copyright to the current economy, again, in agriculture, in chemical industry, in culture industries, in the fashion industry, in software, the extreme centrality of copyright to these massively, massively important industries indicates precisely the opposite. It is a perfect form of property. It is one of the most effective forms that exists.
I mean, I would think that not that the Disney stuff isn't important and more important than, even I realized, but like, the whole example of insulin, like there's the best version of insulin is right now is the one that is very expensive and people die because they can't get it. There are less effective versions that are a little bit cheaper, but like, I feel like most people, when faced with something, and of course the COVID vaccine example, with that level of life or death, can probably be swayed a bit more effectively on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, HIV is a perfectly manageable disease in one country, and if you cross a border, it becomes a death sentence. That has nothing to do with technology.
Yeah.
or rather, it has nothing to do with the medical
Yeah.
technology of retrovirals and has
Yeah.
everything to do with the technologies of state, power, and capital.
And to me, much more minor again, but I don't I think for a while I was just not thinking about IP very much, but the whole simple fact of like it doesn't disappear. If I download a Metallica song in 1999, I have not deprived a single person of that Metallica song. And like as my husband and I have discussed, like I would download a car, particularly if I wasn't taking anyone else's car that perhaps they were using. If the car merely popped into existence, you know? I mean, it is, to me, that is different based on just material reality. Like every time I have a wait on like for a library ebook, I take a moment to think, but that scarcity isn't real at
Yeah.
all. That book could be copied. I don't like what. Why is the scarcity being placed
Yeah.
upon something that
We have the technology now to have literally all visually and auditorially recordable culture ever produced instantly available at our fingertips. It is a
Yeah.
simple technology that we now have access to. And yet, if you want to find something, a particular TV show or movie that you want to watch, you have to search through dozens of streaming services to figure out where it is. Those walls are just IP and they don't make any sense. And they don't make any sense. And they we're constantly coming up against them. And they're constantly making our lives worse, grubbier, more complicated, more expensive. And it has nothing to do with scarcity. And that the thing is, that has always been the case about culture. A poem, you could always memorize a poem and share it. Like, yes, it was more effortful. Now it's as easy as it's ever been to reproduce stuff, right? But a song, once a song is sung, it can't be unsung. And if you can remember it, you can play it.
Yeah.
Culture,
Yeah.
it's a beautiful thing that we do, culture, and that we can share and that we can reproduce. And the state intervenes to make sure that the problems of that, which is to say that it's hard to reap massive profits when something is massively reproducible, solves that
Hmm.
problem with copyright.
Can we do a lightning round to wrap this thing up? Well, the first is a simple Star Wars or Star Trek.
I mean, I grew up on Star Wars, and I haven't watched a ton of Star Trek, but I do think objectively Star Trek's probably better. Star Wars is bad. As a lifelong fan, Star Wars is bad. Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
that's fair. Um, Best concert you ever attended?
Honestly, that one I don't have a good answer because I was in hardcore bands for a decade, so I spent a lot of time playing
Hmm,
in and being at concerts. But I guess I loved the first few years of the techno festival Sustain Release. Were
okay.
some of the best experiences I had.
What did you do in the bands? Which is a
I
side
was
question.
I sang. I was the front person for a bunch
Cool.
of hardcore and punk bands. Yeah.
Cool. Pick an anarchist or radical type to invite over for lunch. Dead or alive?
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's going to be Emma Goldman. What can I say?
Fair enough. I mean, why not? Favorite bird in honor of Ka?
I mean, the favorite in honor of Ka is definitely the humble crow, but I mean, it's got to be Go Birds. It's got to be the Eagles.
I do love a crow,
Yeah.
though. Actually, I love grackles,
Oh,
too. I have a lot of feelings about grackles. There's a lot of bird racism out there.
it's true actually. Yeah, it's very
Yeah,
true.
delicate songbirds only. None of those,
Yeah,
like,
none of those big smart ravens. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. First stop in your time machine, separate from your Emma Goldman lunch, of course.
First stop in my time machine. Goof. This is supposed to be fast, right? I get.
And you can come
Oh yeah,
back, of
yeah.
course. It's very low
Totally,
stakes on
totally.
travel.
I guess I'd want to go forward and see how what we're doing
Mhm.
now, how well we're doing and what we need to change.
I think that's the braver answer, and my answer is invariably to go. I mean, for like 20 years, it was like, I'll go see The Clash in my time
yeah,
machine. There are a lot of concerts
yeah,
to
yeah.
attend.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I
Um,
mean, my brain was like the Paris Commune. I was like, Jesus Christ, I would hate it there. What am I thinking? It's like, no, yeah, yeah.
I mean, speaking French would probably help. I don't
Totally,
know if you.
totally. Yeah, a little bit, but not enough. Certainly not 18th century French.
That's fair. That's true. Um, I guess in honor of the Against Free Speech book, what is like the? Can you recommend something that you disagree with that like is effective or changed you in some fashion? If that makes
Yeah,
sense.
I
Like,
love books like that. I have some of my favorite
mm-hmm,
books are books that the thesis I disagree with, but because they're
mm-hmm,
swinging for the fences so hard, they like end up being really cool. One of them is this guy Elias Canetti, Crowds and Power from the 50s, which
okay,
he claims an entire history of the crowd and society, or sorry, an entire history of society, religion, and everything through the concept of the crowd. It's bananas, but some of the
hmm,
results are absolutely brilliant. Another one like that I like, that's a little more familiar for people, is Jay Sakai's Settlers, um, where again I don't agree with the fundamental thesis that that none of the things done by the white working class was ever particularly was it was always in furtherance of white supremacy, but because of that thesis, he uncovers a lot of histories of the union movement and the communist movement that other people were not willing to touch, and so I think that's an incredibly valuable
hmm.
book as well.
All right, interesting. Best like classic Disney movie.
I love Aladdin. I love Aladdin. I can't
Okay,
help it. I know, but I love it.
I would go with Mulan. I think
Totally. We'll make
probably.
a man out of you.
Um, exactly. I have written down digital or physical media, but I
Honestly,
no.
physical. If we're talking about looking at the thing, if you're shooting the thing, I think physical media looks gorgeous. But I I
Mhm,
I've got no beef with digital media. Just put it on your own hard drives. Don't leave it streaming.
that's fair. Current pet peeve.
I'm really annoyed by the way that marketing language on food talks to you like or on everything talks to you like you're a little fucking baby, or like you're just a cute little guy. I hate that.
Mhm, that's fair. That's fair. Um, an overrated and an underrated intellectual.
Overrated. Oh wow, now I'm gonna get in trouble. Overrated Lenin. Um,
Nice.
um, underrated. Uh, I mean, there's so many. Lots of folks are underrated. Um, but I think basically folks in the Black radical tradition are almost all exclusively underread and underrated.
Is there something you've changed your mind about in the last 5 or 10 years?
Loads of things, I'm sure. I mean, if we go to 12 years, I changed my gender, so
That's
so a
fair.
lot has changed with that. Yeah, I changed my mind about lots of stuff. Yeah, I don't know. That's a hard one. Nothing comes immediately to mind other than transing my gender. Yeah.
That's fair. Last meal, not to be threatening.
God, I mean, honestly, what would my last meal be? It would probably be like something really twisted. Like I'd want like cold, like perfect cold sesame noodles, like dan dan noodles without meat, and also like my mom's potato pancakes. Carbs,
I'll take
carbs.
that.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
sounds pretty good. And I guess the obligatory final is how would I uh, buy a cappuccino in your imagined political utopia?
Oh, I mean, you would. I mean, you wouldn't buy it, but you would probably know someone who had an espresso machine, and you would talk to them about if you could use it, or if you didn't know how, if they could help you make one.
I guess can you add two or three pieces of media that kind of I mean, people should read all your books, but kind of based on what we talked about and stuff, things people should check out.
Yeah, if you're interested in the sort of the Disney question, well, that's the first one I'm going to recommend is the Disney Question by Richard Schickel. I think that's the best other book about Disney. There's another one. No, his is the Disney version.
That's okay.
Richard Schickel's is the Disney version, and there's a more academic one. I think if you're interested in the sort of question of like copyright and originality, I think
Mm,
Richard Woodall's two essays that were published in, I think it was in Real Life magazine, which are referenced in the book. Those are really great. Understanding Disney, the Manufacture of Fantasy, which is edited by Janet Wasco. Understanding Disney is really, really good for the broad look at the corporation.
Is there anything sort of specifically anti-IP that you think is
the Richard Woodall essays are about IP. I think also Cory Doctorow's work in general, although he's not a full abolitionist for IP, but we largely are aligned. He has a few books that are good on that. And if you're looking for like a more introductory book that sort of is critical but isn't about like abolitionist, Aram Sinreich's I think it's just called an Introduction to Intellectual Property or something like that from like 2018 is a good place to start too.
Mm-hmm. I honestly need to read more directly about it.
Well, I mean, part of why people don't know much about it is because it's deadly boring to read about. I mean, like a lot of it's, that's why I'm recommending the books that like are readable. But like, I read textbooks. Like, oh my god, I'm so glad I'm not.
Well, textbooks are just boring on purpose so often. I mean, you can always find a good horrifying anecdote. I feel like that always helps. Exactly. Always gets the attention. Oh my goodness. Okay, well, this was a lot more fun than I imagined when I woke up and was like, why am I congested? Darn it.
I'm so glad.
Where on the internet can the good people find you?
Also tragically on Blue Sky, Vicky Acab on Blue Sky. You can find my work at cawshinythings.com. That's the anarchist worker-owned journal that I'm part of. And I'm also on Letterboxd if you want to read my unhinged movie reviews. That's no cop zone on Letterboxd. So I have a brand. What can I say? So yeah, come through, come hang out. I'm trying to post less, but like Lord knows that's not working.
As usual, listeners, find on Serviam and all the places. I think we finally trashed the worst places. The okay places like Blue Sky, Mastodon. We're out there. And I'm Lucy Stagg on some things, but not on Serviam. All on Serviam. And more importantly, you should go read The Extended Universe, How Disney Killed the Movies and Took Over the World. And maybe you should also check out In Defense of Loot. I haven't done that one yet, but you never know. Vicky, this was a lot of fun, and I thank you very much for this whole talk.
Thank you so much.
All right. You're listening to the Non-Serviam Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, why not subscribe over on our YouTube channel or on your favorite podcast platform. You can also follow us across social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Mastodon. If you're extra interested in seeing this project continue, consider becoming a patron over at patreon.com. But if you can't contribute financially, we still like you a whole lot. You can help us out just by liking and sharing this episode or any other one that catches your fancy. As always, shout out to our existing patrons. Your support helps us reach a larger audience and helps keep this project alive. Thanks so much.